Well, as I said, thank you very much for having me tonight and for giving me the opportunity to discuss and talk again about stone vases, particularly the ones produced in the Roman period. As Francesca said, this has been the subject of my both my undergraduate and postgraduate studies, and also something which I expanded for my postdoc, some of my postdoc projects, including the one which was funded by the EU and Marie Curie Sklodowska actions. So let's say that tonight's talk represents a sort of summary of my research and conclusions on the topic so far, and also a sort of opportunity to throw some points of discussion on these objects, which have a lot of analytical potential, as we are going to see. So let's say that vases made of marble and decorative stone occupy a shadow zone in the study of Roman material culture and material culture production, while falling between the cracks of wider discourses on Roman stone sculpture. Admittedly, stone vases made of marble and polychrome stone are not the most popular, let's say, objects produced by the Roman period. And yet they exist, they were produced, and despite their existence, they've been largely overlooked or subjected to taxonomical analysis. Let's say that, generally speaking, it was believed that stone vases, in which, as we will see, were an important material culture component in a Bronze Age Mediterranean and the Near East. Let's say that they were generally believed to have disappeared from ancient Mediterranean material culture, especially by the Roman period. Such an assumption had, one, given the false idea of stone vases not being produced anymore, and two, that they were not important anymore compared to other productions in glass, in metal, and especially ceramic and pottery. So let's say that my research has been dedicated to helping bring out the analytical potential of these objects. Indeed, let's say that because they're made of stone, stone vases are indestructible. But most importantly, also for my research field, which is the archaeology of production, their making includes subtractive actions, which means that a material is subtracted and not added to it. And this very often leads to marks to be retained or present on the surface of these objects. And this very often allows us to reconstruct the tools, the technology, and the actions behind these tool marks. Being objects that combine technology, stone, which is one of the most probably challenging materials that, let's say, craftspeople have to deal with, They offer, they have a potential for multiple analysis, that is to say, not just from a production point of view, but also within the wider context of material cultural practices, that is to say, why they were made and why they were used and which context they were used. So indeed, they do lend themselves to multiple analysis, and this is due to the fact that they had a range of values and uses, from mundane objects to ritual, used in ritual contexts. Their shapes are also, the variety of the shapes in which these vases occur are also very useful to detect the potential existence of material culture networks, and especially the connections between crafts, as we will see tonight. Other important aspects connected to these objects are indeed the understanding the properties of the materials they were made from, both physical and semiotic. And last but not least, let's say, their use by certain social groups as identity markers, but also certain gender groups, as my recent research has highlighted. So all in all, these are, I believe, remarkable artifacts because they represent the materialization of ingenuity in ancient stoneworking. Last but not least, because we often wonder how we get from a bulky, heavy, huge piece of stone to have something that has the delicacy and the thinness of an eggshell. So let's say that my research has been dedicated to this very fascinating object. So moving on to the next slide. Sorry, I don't know. Okay. Okay. So my research has also, let's say, been motivated by the fact that, as I said, these objects have been mostly overlooked, especially for what concerns classical periods. Much recent research, and here I mention the work by Rachel Sparks or Andrew Bevan on Bronze Age stone vases, has shown that these objects, as we said, were one of the most valued forms of material culture in the Bronze Age Aegean and also early Iron Age societies in the Near Eastern Levantine and Near East, Levant and Egypt. In addition, these studies have shown that the production of stone vessels involved a significant technological input and knowledge transfer, thus playing a key role in the development of prehistoric Mediterranean craft traditions. Similar research, unfortunately, for stone vases produced in later periods, such as the Greek, Roman, and Hellenistic, was lacking and needed to be developed. So my previous research has begun to address the gap in the knowledge by highlighting the existence of a thriving, potentially significant stone vessel industry up to and beyond the 1st century BC. In particular, we now know that a substantial group of vases made from ornamental rocks and white marble were produced between the classical Greek period and the Roman period, including let's say, a short-lived production in Hellenistic period. Let's say that these are chronological boundaries which are used for convention, but technically, as we will see, they all dissolve into each other in the sense that sometimes it's very difficult, especially when it gets to the Hellenistic period, to distinguish from the Hellenistic and the Roman period. which for certain areas, let's say, is not very clear, especially for Egypt. This chronological boundary is not very clear. The aims and objectives of my talk tonight are obviously to focus on two particular aspects that emerge from my analysis. First of all, I would like to introduce the theme of the chaine operatoires approach in understanding the production of these objects, and also the theme of craft interaction and cross-fertilization, particularly, let's say, contribute to the understanding of Roman stone-based crafts, which is to say sculpture. Now, as we have said, when it comes to discourses of Roman sculpture, usual or traditional, let's say, debates include and mainly focus on architectural elements, sarcophagi, and statuary. But as we're going to show tonight, these stone vases were produced in the Roman period, and in these acknowledging their existence and beginning to understand their production and how they fit in with the wider practices in Roman sculpture helps adding more a deeper understanding, a more nuanced understanding of Roman sculpture. So let's start with introducing the data sets. So how many vases do we know? Well, let's say that so far I've been able to catalog 250 examples. This is a total which is, I would say, ever growing, in a sense that unfortunately past excavations carried out in a non-scientific way, private collecting, dispersion, looting, have obviously had a bearing on the numbers, on the known examples of this production. So let's say that the vases that can be confidently said to be from the Roman period are about total about 250 examples. Of these, 115 come from early imperial funerary contexts, where they had been used or reused, as we will see, as ash containers. And this has allowed a better, let's say, preservation of these objects, and has also allowed for a deeper understanding of the context of use to be carried out. Let's say that all in all, despite obviously data set problems and bias, this was a limited production. Both chronologically and numerically. Chronologically, because let's say that the substantial nucleus of these objects is produced between what I believe is the peak of production, which is the Julio-Claudian period. That is to say, between the end of the 1st century BC and the mid-late 1st century AD. So, what are these objects made for? Well, we mentioned the fact that they are made of decorative stone, and the fact that they exist some made of white marble. Let's say that historically speaking, the most used lithic materials for vases in general, so not just Roman, but also previous productions, include granites, porphyries, breccias, and calcite alabasters, with calcite alabaster being the favorite, the top material for this kind of production at any moment in history, starting from pharaonic Egypt, as we will see. Other lithic materials used for vases and containers and other containers include gypsum, alabaster, limestone, obsidian, rock crystal, and agate, which are also defined semi-precious stone, partly because of their value, but also because they are very hard and very difficult to work. In fact, stones are usually classified by their hardness and are distinguished into soft and hard, with a boundary of 3 on the Mohs scale, which is the scale we use to measure the hardness of lithic materials, depending on the minerals they made of. Other materials include steatite, chlorite, more or less, let's say, greater or lesser hardness, but also basalt and serpentinitis, as we will see. Obviously, as we imagine, the distinction between soft and hard stones includes or means that a certain technical distinction in manufacturing methods existed. Some tools were more suitable for certain materials than others. Let's say that one of the reasons why calcite alabaster predominates in the production of stone vases of all times is the fact that it is a relatively soft medium, being, let's say, being placed on level 3 of the Mohs scale. In the Roman period, so let's say in a Julio-Claudian production of stone vases, we also notice that the majority are made from stones which were quarried in Egyptian Eastern Desert, whose quarries started to be increasingly exploited after the annexation of Egypt to Rome in 31 BC, so after the Battle of Actium. So the roughly 9 extraction sites for alabaster yielded the varieties we find in most Roman contexts, starting from the very end of the 1st century BC, followed by purple porphyry, quarried at Mons Porphyritis, a variety of, or several varieties of basalt, quarried between Wadi Amamat in Eastern Desert, but also some varieties coming from Widen El Faras in the Fayoum area, and granite quarried in the famous Aswan district, which yielded the very famous pink-red variety of this stone. So what exactly are these urns? Let's say that they can be roughly divided into into 2 groups. So the first group, which I conveniently divided according to the shape, is what I call the Turin cinerary urns. So Turin, why? Because obviously, as we can see, the shape recalls that of a modern soup dish. As we will see later on. There are about 70 examples of these objects, and they come into use and begin to be produced between the end of the 1st century BC, with some very late uses at the beginning of the 2nd century AD. Again, the production peak of these objects is in the Julio-Claudian period, particularly in Rome, where I locate the workshops or the main center of production of these objects. Alongside the Turin, we have a group of vases, let's say, some, again, between 65 and 70 in number, which I have so far located, which present, as we see, very miscellaneous shapes. And we have some examples. such as jugs on a koi, craters of various shapes and profiles, small amphorae, and very large amphorae. So these are the shapes I've been able to, let's say, identify so far. We don't have the time to illustrate all the main characteristics, but I'm going to focus on the selection of shapes which are important and relevant to our argument today. Other shapes include situli and what I call a sort of kista shape. These latter two shapes were also used in funerary contexts. As I said at the start, some of these vases had been used or more likely reused in Roman burials. The shapes include trays and plates of various sizes. Other shapes are in fragments, but it's been possible to reconstruct thanks to, let's say, well, been drawn and been possible to reconstruct thanks to their, starting from the existing fragments. And as we can see here, also the materials can vary. Some varieties include a green type of stone, which hasn't yet been identified. In fact, it's important, I would like to stress the fact that certain stones are of uncertain origins and provenance. I let's say, said that the majority was probably quarried in an Egyptian eastern desert, but obviously when it comes to stone, it's always better to be sure by carrying out archaeometric analysis, and this obviously concerns a very small sample of these objects. So I would be cautious with stone attribution. So let's say that having seen more or less what kind of objects we're dealing with, I'd like, as I said, to provide some insights into the production of these objects, to see what they can tell us about workshop organization, artisan and craft interaction, knowledge transfer, and technological innovation and exchange. So how and to what extent these phenomena were taking place in the Roman period. One caveat, something to be aware of, is the fact that we currently lack physical workplaces, as if to say, we don't have that I know of, excavated workshops from the Roman period, datable to the Roman period, where these objects were produced. Meaning that most of our evidence comes either from other periods or from it's based on the actual finished artifacts. However, this can be integrated with ethno-anthropological approaches, which have also represented a substantial part of my research so far, in order, let's say, aimed at increasing the body of evidence and filling the gap in the actual archaeological evidence in terms of workplaces. So let's say that these objects can be studied through the lens of two important approaches. One is the chaine operatoire, which was, let's say, applied, well, developed within the field of prehistoric archaeology, so outside the field of classical archaeology, and first applied by Leroy-Guérin in 1993 to the study of knapping and flint stones and flint tools. So the idea was to, as the word says, which translates as operational sequence, let's say in English, is to understand the various stages of production of an artifact. These let's say, approach has been has kind of slowly made its way into classical archaeology, which was still very much, let's say, dominated by outdated approach to object study, which looked at the object as an artifact, as a piece of work, but let's say that nothing behind it in many ways, and let's say that with more or less success, because this has allowed the artisan and the tools used in the production of objects to be included in the discourse, so not just art historical analysis. Yet recently, this approach has been, let's say, criticized in a sense that has been kind of criticized for being particularly rigid or too rigid, against the fact that making is a process which is alive, and it's obviously not a fixed repetition of gestures, but the artisan, also according to his, also interacting with the material he's working, sort of constantly modulates and let's say and changes. So something which shouldn't be as a rigid process. Also, on the other hand, cross-craft interaction is now become a recognized feature of ancient craft, but since, let's say, its first application in for the study of ancient, well, Massimian, again, Bronze Age Greek art and material culture by Anne Brisbane. And more recently, let's say, also applied by several scholars, including Elizabeth Murphy, to the Roman world. Whilst the existence of strong connections between industries and crafts has been recognized and is in the process of being acknowledged and studied and given attention in current debates, let's say that it is also has also been recognized that it is difficult sometimes to pin down, again, due to the lack of more factual evidence. Let's say that the existence of of connections between crafts had already been highlighted as early as 1947 by the American scholar Dorothy Kent-Hill, who observed that tools and forms from one industry to another were being exchanged, and she based this observation on let's say the similarities between the shapes of Greek vases, pottery Greek vases, and metal vases. Obviously, ever since her approach, her work has been so reviewed and updated, sometimes also criticized. However, let's say her observations remain valid and have sort of given start to this way of looking at networks between industries and between crafts. Something which let's say has become very clear, especially in Roman archaeology, as we have said. The existence of cross-craft interaction, so the interaction between crafts, the exchange of tools, the exchange of techniques, and also the interaction between the actual agents or actors of crafts, which are the craftspeople, let's say, can also be interpreted in various ways. So, for example, we talk about vertical and horizontal interactions for what concerns, for example, the type of craft. So vertical when this interaction happens and connections or multitasking skills happen within the same craft, or horizontal when, let's say, similarities and interactions are noticed across different crafts, which, let's say, are in many ways material based or defined, as if to say each craft is sort of characterized or dominated by the particular material which is worked. Let's say that as we will see, sometimes not just sometimes, these boundaries, these sort of boundaries between materially defined crafts are, let's say, don't exist. Also, for example, cross-craft interaction allows knowledge to be transferred. And again, both in a vertical direction and in a horizontal direction. And here we have an example of the, let's say, the ability of Roman artisans, in this case stone workers, to multitask, as advertised in these inscriptions, which is said to be what survives of a workshop advertising inscription engraving and as well as marble cutting. Obviously, the question remains, was the same artisan responsible for the whole production sequence? And also, was indeed the same artisans able to cross the boundaries of crafts? This obviously question, this remains open to question. Let's say that not just human networks, but also material networks are something that has been identified in material culture studies, and it's been, let's say, visually represented and epitomized by Karl Knappett, whose study of Mycenaean of Bronze Age pottery at the Bronze Age palatial sites of Mallia in Crete brought him to sort of visualize this kind of relationships we're talking about between materials, between workshops, artisans, and crafts. This was done by essentially. Okay, no, I'm not able to get rid of this. It was done essentially by considering, for example, the shapes of the objects, the materials of the objects, as in this case, metal, bronze, and stone, and also the, let's say, operational sequence, which included, for example, the formation of the clay, the formation of the shape, and also the finishing of the surface. So by putting together all these elements emerging from the study of Bronze Age pottery at the palatial workshops in Crete, Karl Knappett, let's say, came up with this idea of material networks to visualize using network analysis. And these are network graphs of this kind of relationship. So this is, let's say, the visual, this gives us a visual idea of the kind of interactions, networks we are talking about between materials, people, and objects. And all three of these aspects must be considered when we talk about material culture and material culture productions. In particular, Karl Knappett started, hypothesized the existence of these links based also on what he called the skeuomorphism of these objects. Skeuomorphism is a word, concept introduced in the 19th century, in late 19th century design theory. to explain the occurrence of the same shape in multiple materials. Said it very briefly and very to put it very simple, because it's a lot more complicated than this. However, this was the idea. So the repetition of a shape or of a model of a part of that shape in multiple materials. This concept, I believe, has been recently, let's say, cited by by a term or by a concept, which is basically that of transmateriality. Again, transmateriality is, let's say, an alternative, among other things, an alternative way to look at skeuomorphism, which is, as we said, the rendering of shapes or motives across multiple materials. And it's actually, I believe, a neutral and in agreement with Wolf, a better term to, let's say, explain this kind of phenomenon. Also because skeuomorphism has been seen for a long time as a phenomenon mainly of imitation, and mainly due to mimic richer or more expensive media, in poorer media, to make obviously more affordable objects, and this is based on a hierarchy of material and values, which is rather questionable. I myself have explored the idea of skeuomorphism applied to these objects, but I do realize that perhaps transmateriality is a more nuanced way of looking at this. The concept of transmateriality can actually be let's say, explored further and further, because there are different levels of this phenomenon, depending, again, as the prefix suggests, it happens at material level, so the matter of objects, but in many ways, it is the product of the combination of artisanal gestures, so the action and agency of artisans, as well as of the use of certain tools. For this reason, that the prefix helps, let's say, sharpen what could be a difference between and ways this kind of phenomenon takes place. So, for example, whilst transmateriality results from an object, shape, or detail crossing material boundaries and occurring in more than one material, as we said, akin to skeuomorphism, I'm very sorry, but this is not going away. Multimateriality shows the ability of an artisan to operate on multiple materials which have distinct properties. So multi-materials with different properties, and the artisan has the ability to span from one material to the other, but also the material to be adapted into different forms. And of course, materiality, which allows us to understand the ability of an artisan to operate on diverse materials which are incorporated into one. And this is akin to the concept of intermediality, which has also been applied, which has been developed within also the field of philology and literature, as a reflection of similar phenomenon, but with text, so intertextuality and all of that. In fact, transmateriality is a concept itself developed outside the field of classical archaeology, but in design theory, among others. And the last one is intramateriality, which results from the ability of the artisan, but also of the material, to be, especially of similar materials, to be processed by the same artisans. And for example, we go back to that previous epigraphy inscription, which showed that people within the same workshops were able to work on multiple scales. But also, this is the kind of phenomena we are looking at when we study Roman stone vases. So evidence of ancient stone vase working, as we have said. So let's go back to how we can integrate these debates with the archaeological evidence. Well, as we have said, stone vase working has been, let's say, the center of attention for what concerns several areas, and especially, let's say, between the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, as we can see here from the dates. Many countries, many ancient societies engaged in the production of these objects. This included Egypt, where production of such objects spanned from the pharaonic all the way to the Greco-Roman period, and remains, in terms of volume of objects produced, tools developed, technologies, and variety of stones, one of the most important for what concerns the production of these objects. Workshops were excavated at Memphis, Naucratis, some also identified the Hierakonpolis polis. We don't have time to delve in each one of them, but we do have evidence of stoneworking at these sites, represented by both tools and mostly workshop wasters, that is, discarded vases. Other ancient societies that produced stone vessels are Turkey, of course, Crete, Mycenaean and Minoan and Mycenaean Crete, Mesopotamia. There is a substantial evidence of production in Levant and Cyprus, up to including Jerusalem and Saragossa in Spain. But these latter two cases, especially Saragossa, have yielded evidence of much later date. Obviously, this includes a selection of studies and the better studied also contexts. Ethnoanthropological studies, which I'm going to simply, let's say, limit to mentioning that by Hester and Heiser, which has sort of inspired, together with that of Dennis Stokes, my approach. Let's say it's been very important because they actually surveyed a modern stone vase manufacturing workshop in Egypt, which turned out to be actually one of the few that were still producing calcite alabaster vases in non-mechanized way. So they had the opportunity to study the production of these objects almost using the same techniques as the ones developed and used in the pharaonic period. So their survey, which included the analysis of the complete chain operatoire, starting from the provisioning of the material, that is the basically the provisioning, the quarrying of the material, so how the material was quarried and transported, through to the preparation of the blocks of stone for preliminary carving, and most importantly, the phases that precede the preparation for hollowing the interior, which interestingly included this very interesting technique of coating the exterior of the vase with glue, alabaster dust, and strips of cloth soaked with this glue to harden the exterior surface. But interestingly, some of it was also poured inside of the vase once the preliminary hollowing had started. And also the observation of the actual drilling of the interior, which is the most complex let's say, aspect of stone carving due to the high risk of breakage. And this was done by means of drill bits, which were each time, so every 20 minutes, they were changed. As the interior was being hollowed and therefore was changing shape, was expanding. This latter part was very important because we do have evidence of, unlike the Roman period, of ancient Egyptian craftspeople producing and making stone vases let's say, in painted scenes within buildings, Egyptian buildings. But because the tool is inside the vase, it's very difficult. Well, basically, it's very difficult to reconstruct the aspect of the drill bit, the actual drill bit, which could have been made of movable parts like borders or a tubular piece. Which allowed the hollowing into one solid core, which was then extracted from the vase. Following the shape, the hollowing of the interior, the shaping of the exterior could take place, and it was observed that between the hollowing of the interior and the polishing of the exterior with files, the walls were reduced to a remarkable, spectacular 1.5 centimeter thickness, which is the same thickness of most of the vases I have analyzed from the Roman period. So, as I said, a very remarkable, stunning thickness, thinness, as we could say. The last, let's say, the last step was polishing the exterior surface using a layer of Alexandria wax, which enhanced the polish and the color of the stone. I have come across vases which still preserved layers or traces of, or ancient vases, of course, of this layer of oil or wax on the surface. Very interestingly, the workmen weren't engaging in a continuous sequence, but they seemed to be, let's say, skipping and swapping and going from one vase to another. So basically, they did not focus or work on a single vase, but on multiple tasks at the same time at different stages. Also, other interesting aspects were the understanding of training and apprenticeship, which started as early as the age of 12. Very interestingly, these objects showed the minimal breakage was confirmed by the let's say, the lack of waste, and by the fact that which clearly showed that the artisans were, let's say, experienced, they're familiar with the pressure to apply on the stone. As I said, most of the breakage happens at hollowing stage, and the fact that no much waste was produced by the workshop showed and suggested that these artisans were extremely aware, familiar with the pressure to apply to the stone and the properties of the stone. Of course, being alabaster, a very can be brittle, and it's not a compact stone, but it's actually quite troublesome and difficult to work, and with a very high risk of breakage. So all of this evidence together, let's see what we can let's say, how can be applied to the Roman cases. Well, first of all, as we said, we are going to concentrate on our first case study today, which is the Turin urns. So what are the Turin urns? The Turin urns, as we said, are vase-shaped funerary urns, which were found in elite burials across the Roman Empire, mostly the western part of the empire, with the highest number found in Rome. Which occur in 3 different body profiles, depending on the dimensions and the proportions. So we have type A, which is longer than wider, type B, which is wider than, and let's say, where the dimensions of height and width are almost corresponding, and thus identify sort of a cube. And C, which is where the width is, let's say, higher than, it's wider, well, greater than the height. These urns occur in the majority in calcite alabaster, which, as we said, is the stone in which most of these objects were produced. But some examples are also recorded in granite, in basalt, and in porphyry. One of the characteristics of these urns is the separate carving into, so it's the, let's say, separate carving into distinct elements, these being the foot, the lid, and the knob or finial of the lid. And this happened through a, let's say, by a system of sockets, round sockets in the lid and at the bottom of the urn, which corresponded tenons, which were then inserted in the circular slots and together glued by means of a possibly, well, organic columns, organic glues, which over time have disintegrated, and in fact most of these elements have come loosened, and this has allowed me to analyze the carving techniques very closely. As we said, we don't have a huge number of these objects. Most of them are in private collections in museums, have been restored over time. So it is an actual privilege sometimes to be able to find genuine features which are detached and detachable, so as to allow the analysis of this system. And here we can see some of the genuine examples. As we also we see that the surface around the tenons is actually and this was in all probability due to was a device to secure the grip of the elements to their sockets. Instead, that this kind of technique is observable for it's been observed interestingly for the production of different of larger stone let's say sculpture, as in the case of basins or fountain basins and their stands, where, as we can see here, we have the similar system of slots and tenons with the same feature of let's say peaked surface around the tenons, and as well as sort of let's say tradition which is found so in earlier production. As we have said, stone vessel production developed and reached its peak in the Bronze Age, and here we have an example of a composite stone vessel from Crete. But I also had the opportunity to further confirmation that this technique was also in place in classical, well, was also applied to classical stone vases, as we will see produced in Greece in the classical period in the 5th, 4th century BC. Interestingly, this kind of technique of assembling parts finds also parallels in contemporary craft productions, such as, for example, metal. And here we have an example based on this very interesting documentary and video produced by the Getty Museum, which I cannot see unfortunately here. Oh, there we go. Which shows the assembly, the joining of different parts to make one single object. So let's say that this technique was common to many materials, and is found across objects produced from different materials. So when we're talking about all those aspects of transmateriality. Another important aspect is to be considered is the fact that this technique is also found and was also used for the production or conversion or recycling of non-tureens, as if to say contemporary vases produced in the same period or around the same period as the tureens were benefiting probably from parts used with the same techniques used for the production of tureens. And sometimes this would be added, as I have argued elsewhere, to more ancient vases for their reconversion and recycling, possibly as funerary urns, given the fact that most of them have been found in Roman burials. And also here we have further, let's say, further examples, more examples of this practice. In this case, we have a, let's say, a tureen style lead with finial added to a much earlier vase. I am actually, an article dedicated to this typology is in press and will be released soon, where I discuss this type of vases more in depth. As we can see here, so parts were added new to existing vases for their recycle. So recycle is also practice which happens in a period almost contemporary to the production of fresh vases. And this happens for several reasons, which we are not going to discuss today, because it's a completely different topic. So let's say that my experiments on these subjects have focused on those examples that have been preserved with the genuine features, particularly one example, which was one of a trio found in Rome, dating to the Julio-Claudian period, which I have analyzed very closely, and I used as a template for the reconstruction of the carving sequence. Carving sequence, which I, let's say, for which I envisage roughly 7 phases, starting from phase 0, which we will see, which is the accurate squaring of the block. And this is very important because, although very highly speculative, because obviously we lack that part, having the stone been subtracted, that had to be integrated with observation of modern day practices, as we will see in a very shortly. So the stage, obviously here, the stages here are divided also according to some experimental rates using let's say other studies by other scholars on similar objects, especially for the Egyptian period, and again they are highly speculative, but they should give an idea more or less of what the operational sequence involved in terms of steps. How many people and who was involved at any of these stages obviously remains open to interpretation. As we said earlier, the squaring was a very important part of the carving process, because this is how the artisan kind of work out portions and several parts to be carved, and so based on the metrology and dimensions of the these urns, I myself have sort of envisaged come up with a reconstruction of the squaring of the initial block of stone, which, as we have seen, started from a parallelepiped, and it was slowly reduced to as many geometric, let's say, shapes as were the parts of the final product, of the final urn. Also, I initially hypothesized that the hollowing of the tureens was happening by means of tubular drilling, because obviously based on some of the tool marks I was able to retrieve on the bottom of these objects, which I'm going to say are as smooth on the inside as they are on the outside. So it's very difficult to retrieve tool marks. And in order to, let's say, recuperate the costly waste, according to a practice which is also still in place, of reusing the core from the extraction of the vase, sometimes the feet and the finial could be cut from it. And obviously, and this is an hypothesis, a supposition, which is being based on the study of one particular urn. But as I often point out, there is no model fits all, and as if to say, this is an example of a possible potential operational sequence, but it's not definite. And it must have also been, let's say, adapted and changed according to the artisan and the material. And it is suggested by modern day practices and by the fact that working stone is it requires a series of steps which must be carefully planned, but also modulated, because once stone has been subtracted, it cannot be added. So as we said, it's a non-subtractive, it's a subtractive form of craft. So let's say that altogether, the reconstruction of the sequence has been sided with what were the possible tools involved, let's say that again these are highly speculative. And how do we know that the chain opertoire could be could fail, could vary? Different hands could be working at the same time, or different types of skills involved at the same time? Well, because these objects are not perfect. In fact, I could identify a series of flaws and variations to the basic model. In fact, we, as in this case, for example, the urn appears out of axis, even though, let's say, at first sight seems to be quite harmonious and quite well carved. And this is actually one of the best carved examples. I've identified as many variations of the profile, of the body profile, which we already mentioned, being divided into 3 general types, but also of the, let's say, of the different profiles of the lid, of the handle, of the finial, and of the foot. And in fact, I must say that these are found regardless of the type. So they are all mixed together. There is no pattern. There is no exact combination of these types in relation to another. However, we can say that, for example, certain types are predominant than others, and this could be indicative of a particular workshop or of a particular artisan. At the same time, this table gives us an idea of the type of variability we can find within the type, the tureen. This table refers to the three tureens found in the same context we saw earlier. And the fact you can see that not only measures vary, but also let's say the types of the separated individual elements change, goes to show that let's say the production was far from being flawless. Was actually a constant adaptation, modulation due to artisan skills, tools employed, but also, and we should not forget, customer requirements and taste, which also played an important part within the chain opertoire. We now quickly move towards the miscellaneous vases, which are the ones which, let's say, represent, I would say, the materialization of this transmateriality phenomenon. These vases are, like the tureens, are produced in a period of Roman history, which is the beginning of the 1st century AD, which is characterized by a marked experimentation in terms of shapes, materials, and of course, as we will see, the introduction of new tools, so technological innovation. Let's say that in this period, artisans like to experiment with the infinite possibilities of the materials they are using, they are carving. Alabaster, porphyry, granite are all new stones which don't exist, let's say, up to before in earlier periods. And these obviously are materials which also are sought after and are particularly trendy in a period, in the early Imperial period. And of course, we find that the most frequent shapes are those which we find in contemporary productions, in more or less precious materials like cameo glass, metal, precious metal, also, for example, Arretine pottery, stone itself. As we can see, there is almost an exact correspondence between these shapes and the various materials they are translated in a very, let's say, admirable way. So the artisans are also exploring and playing with the colors, the hues offered by the stone. By no means this seems to be due to let's say a process of imitation where the most expensive material is being reproduced or imitated. Here, stone, I think, represents very well I think represents a very tangible evidence of the fact material art is relative when it comes to this, but to make the difference are actually the artisans, the tools, and their skills. Objects are, details are also rendered in stone, as we can see in the case of vases, which are provided with carved elements like peaks, but also, for example, the handles. We've seen the example of the situlae in porphyry, which occur also in white marble and which present features which are in all very similar to those found on metal ones. And again, details which are reproduced, repeated on multiple materials are found in also these vases. Features which are indicative, I believe, of the the crossing of crafts, techniques, and as we will see, of tools. And in fact, one of my let's say arguments and the scopes of my recent Marie Curie project was that to understand the extent of the application of lathe. The lathe, which is a rotary tool, which I have found evidence on several vases, both from the Roman period, as we will see, but also from earlier periods. I call the lathe the tool of transmateriality because, as we can see here, the applications of this tool are actually infinite. They're found on a number of objects produced contemporary to the production of these vases, which span from ivory to metal and glass and bronze. But I also call it, and this seems to be a sort of innovation which is introduced roughly around the same period as the appearance of these vases in the Roman period. Sorry, here the slide seems to have had a problem. Let's say that the idea was to look for evidence of the uses of the shape of a lathe, and what evidence we have regarding the use of the lathe. Let's say, which is at the moment limited for what concerns the Roman period to objects. Let's say that the etymology of the word itself, especially as Pliny says, he had become a very popular tool at his time, seems to suggest that it did undergo a sort of evolution. And this might have involved also the power which propelled such a machine. So starting from possibly a rod and ending with, in all probability, in the most sophisticated, let's say, examples of it in water-propelled, let's say, specimen. Water power is not a novelty. We know it existed in Roman engineering and Roman crafts, especially. We don't have many, let's say, we don't have much evidence, but we do have some about, for example, the extensive use of saw mills and saws for stone propelled by water. And let's say my next step is to let's say sharpen, to identify and to prove that at one point Roman lapidary lathes were propelled by water, because water gives it enough power to stone to be worked. But more rudimentary types of lathes, which were probably propelled by means of a wheel, seem to have been in action in Jerusalem in the Second Temple period workshops that produced chalk vessels, which yielded an enormous amount of unfinished vessels and wasters, as well as lathe parts. Including the spikes and plugs, which secured the vase to the lathe. Two types of lathes apparently were in use, a vertical and an horizontal one, depending on the size of the vessels to be worked. And this could be also quite heavy, showing that ancient lathes were perfectly capable of being used for stone working, which also included hard stones like porphyry, as I could, let's say, prove by my analysis and study of some porphyry vases from the Roman period. All of this combined shows that Roman stone vases were indeed the product of important innovation, which were introduced further to possible knowledge exchange, artisan migration, and artisan interaction, as well as the crossing of crafts. Something like this, which let's say sits between innovation, but also tradition, as we have seen. This idea of assembling the different parts can be traced back to a lot earlier examples. And this was, let's say, the aim also of my technique project, that of going backwards, let's say, and analyze previous stone vase traditions to identify let's say, the origin of certain techniques. Let's say that this can be found in a group of stone vases produced in Greece, in white marble, Parian marble. Again, we're talking about some 400 different shapes, examples in several different shapes, of which, among which Pixidis, Exalepta are the predominant type, and which I have obviously studied cataloged for my project. These objects are again found in ritual and ceremonial contexts. Most of them seems to have been connected to female practices like weddings and fertility rituals. And the most important group, which also gives us a bit of a time frame, is the one found in the 1900s. Beginning of the 20th century in Rhenia in Greece, in the so-called purification pit, which also, as I said, gives us an exact chronological time frame, showing that certain types had been already developed, produced by that time. The most important other groups include vases found in other parts of the Mediterranean, although not many, because their distribution seems to be mostly concentrated in Greece, are the ones from Ascoli Satriano in South Italy.
Sorry, Simona, due to the time, I'm really so sorry, but it's a very interesting topic. Could you kind of draw the conclusions?
Absolutely. In fact, I was
that'd be great.
No
Thank
problem.
you so much.
Sorry, I've lost track of time because I don't have a clock right. I'm so
no worries. It is very fascinating. So we would like to have a couple of questions, so we have time for that. Okay, thank you so much, Simona.
No problem. So the idea was that I tested my reconstruction of the lathe and of the tools employed, and indeed, let's say that different solutions were applied to included the application of different solutions and different techniques. But most importantly, evidence of lathe turning has been substantiated and found, as we can see. So let's say that the lathe is something which occurs at a very early stage. Obviously, this is all in the process of elaboration and of, let's say, examination from my side, due to the backlog of the COVID pandemic backlog on my project schedule. This also involved the making of a replica, where artisans were commissioned with the production of a replica, and whose stages are in phase of elaboration. So this is all very preliminary and very new. But most importantly, they were given the object to, let's say, to recreate, and they did it according to what they would have done if they were an ancient artisan. And let's say that the results were very promising, because it confirmed the existence of steps, of a chaine operatoire, something which is detectable at level of ancient objects, as well as, obviously, this involved, unfortunately, the use of modern lathe, but most importantly, that the majority of the tools were still the ones employed in the ancient period. So the same tool marks I was able to find on the surface of most of these objects have been, correspond to the ones which are still in use today by these artisans, these Greek artisans, which work for the experienced carvers and restorers of ancient monuments. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that stone, as we can see from stone vases, the evidence of Roman stone vases, concepts like chaine operatoires maintain their validity, of course, but as been warned by other scholars, we must be also aware of the fact that these are not at all fixed or rigid models, but we need also to take into account several factors, which include the human factor, the tools employed, and of course the interaction of the artisan with its material. At the same time, I believe that these vases represent the materialization and the tangible evidence of the existence of of material networks, as well as cross-craft interaction in the Roman period, despite the lack of physical places. Like workshops, which of course, once found, would be able to give us more information and confirm or disprove what so far we have been able to understand and reconstruct for what concerns the production of Roman stone vases. And with this, I conclude, and I also want to say that as I said, the results are in preparation. And are going to be uploaded for free as an open access resource on the project database. I apologize with the organizers for running, lost track of time, and I'm going to stop sharing the presentation if that's okay with you.